1. Is inflammation a universal sign of aging? New study challenges common beliefs. 2. Inflammaging. Is aging the same for everyone? New study reveals surprising differences. 1. Is inflammation a universal sign of aging? New study challenges common beliefs. Inflammaging isn't a one-size-fits-all phenomenon when it comes to aging. New research reveals how inflammation's role in aging varies dramatically across global populations. A groundbreaking study by researchers at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health challenges the notion that inflammation is an inevitable part of aging. The research suggests that inflammaging, a persistent, low-level inflammation linked to aging, may not be a universal experience among humans. Instead, it appears to be shaped by lifestyle and environment, with stark differences observed between industrialized societies and indigenous communities. The study analyzed data from 4 distinct populations, 2 industrialized groups, the Italian Inchianti study and the Singapore Longitudinal Aging Study, SLAS, and 2 indigenous, non-industrialized groups, the Tsimane of the Bolivian Amazon and the orang Asli of peninsular Malaysia. While the inflammatory signature was similar in the industrialized populations, it did not hold in the indigenous groups, where inflammation levels were largely driven by infection rather than age. Lead author Alan Cohen, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia Mailman School, explained, in industrialized settings we see clear links between inflammaging and diseases like chronic kidney disease. But in populations with high infection rates, inflammation seems more reflective of infectious disease burden than of aging itself. The study highlights that in indigenous communities, even though people often have high baseline inflammation, it doesn't increase with age and doesn't lead to the chronic illnesses seen in industrialized societies. For example, diabetes, heart disease, and Alzheimer's are rare in these groups, meaning that young indigenous individuals may appear similar to older industrialized adults on the surface, but their health outcomes differ significantly. Cohen emphasized, these findings really call into question the idea that inflammation is inherently harmful. Rather, it appears that inflammation and perhaps other aging mechanisms may be highly context-dependent. On one hand, this complicates scientific answers because there are no universal solutions. On the other hand, it's promising as it suggests we can intervene and change things. The study used a panel of 19 cytokines to assess inflammation patterns. While these markers aligned with aging in the Italian and Singaporean datasets, they didn't replicate in the Tsimane and orang Asli, whose immune systems were shaped by persistent infections and distinct environmental exposures. Key findings include: approximately 66% of Tsimane had at least one intestinal parasitic infection, over 70% of orang Asli had prevalent infections. Inflammaging markers were strongly linked to chronic disease in industrialized populations, but not in indigenous groups. The study challenges the assumption of universal aging biomarkers, suggesting instead that immune aging processes are population-specific and heavily influenced by the exposome, the totality of environmental, lifestyle, and infectious exposures. Cohen explained, these results point to an evolutionary mismatch between our immune systems and the environments we now live in. Inflammaging may not be a direct product of aging, but rather a response to industrialized conditions. The authors urge a reevaluation of how aging and inflammation are measured across populations, emphasizing the need for standardized, context-aware tools. Factors like environment, lifestyle, such as high physical activity or a very low-fat diet, and infection may all influence how the immune system ages, said Cohen. Understanding how these elements interact could help develop more effective global health strategies. Co-authors are listed in the manuscript. The study was supported by the Impetus program, the French National Research Agency, ANR, under the Investments for the Future, Investissements d'Avenir program, grant ANR 17, EURE 0010. The Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, DFG, German Research Foundation, under Project ID 499552394, SFB 1597/1, and Grant HE 9198/1-1, and the Intramural Research Program of the NIH National Institute on Aging. This research underscores the importance of considering cultural and environmental factors in understanding aging and inflammation. As Cohen noted, we're not just looking at the body's response to age, it's about how our bodies adapt to the world around us. 2. Inflammaging. Is aging the same for everyone? New study reveals surprising differences. What if one of the most widely accepted truths about aging is actually a myth? For decades, the scientific community has largely agreed that as we grow older, our bodies become increasingly inflamed, a process known as inflammaging, which is thought to quietly drive the development of chronic illnesses like heart disease, dementia, and diabetes. But here's where things get interesting. A groundbreaking new study is challenging this long-held belief, and the results could upend how we understand aging itself. Let's break it down. The concept of inflammaging describes a state where the immune system, instead of calming down with age, stays on high alert. Imagine your body's defense system constantly fighting invisible threats, slowly wearing itself out and damaging healthy tissues in the process. This has been considered a near-universal feature of aging, especially in modern societies. But is it really universal? A recent study published in Nature Aging took a closer look at this question by comparing inflammation patterns in 4 very different populations. 2 of these groups were from highly industrialized countries, older adults living in Italy and Singapore. The other 2 were indigenous communities, the Tsimane people of the Bolivian Amazon and the orang Asli living in the forests of Malaysia, both of whom maintain more traditional lifestyles. Researchers analyzed blood samples from over 2,800 individuals, measuring a variety of inflammatory molecules called cytokines. Their aim was to see if the same age-related rise in inflammation previously observed in Western populations also appeared in these diverse groups. And this is the part most people miss. The answer wasn't straightforward. Among the Italian and Singaporean participants, the expected pattern emerged: levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein and tumor necrosis factor increased with age. And these higher levels were linked to a greater risk of chronic diseases such as kidney and heart disease. This seemed to confirm the inflammaging theory, at least for these populations. But the story took a surprising turn with the Tsimane and orang Asli. In these indigenous groups, the researchers did not observe the same consistent rise in inflammatory markers as people aged. Even more intriguing, these markers were not strongly associated with age-related diseases. For example, the Tsimane, who are frequently exposed to infections from parasites and other pathogens, often had elevated inflammation. Yet, they experienced remarkably low rates of heart disease, diabetes, and dementia, conditions that are rampant in industrialized societies. So, what's going on here? Could it be that inflammaging isn't a universal aspect of aging after all? The findings suggest that chronic inflammation in older age may not be an inevitable biological process, but rather a consequence of modern lifestyles. Think high-calorie diets, sedentary habits, and limited exposure to infectious agents. In traditional societies where people are more physically active, eat differently, and regularly encounter infections, the immune system may function in a fundamentally different way. In these contexts, higher inflammation might simply reflect a healthy, adaptive response to environmental challenges, not a sign of the body breaking down. But here's a controversial twist. Some scientists argue that inflammaging could still be happening in all humans, just not in ways that are detectable by measuring blood cytokines. It's possible that inflammation is occurring at the cellular or tissue level, hidden from the standard blood tests used in this research. If that's the case, are we missing the bigger picture? Why does this matter? If these results hold up, they could have major implications for how we diagnose and treat age-related inflammation. The biomarkers used to define inflammaging in European or Asian populations might not be relevant for everyone, even within industrialized countries. This also means that lifestyle interventions like exercise, dietary changes, or anti-inflammatory medications may not have the same effects across different populations. What works for city dwellers might be unnecessary or even ineffective for those living traditional lifestyles. And this is the part that could spark debate. Much of what we know about aging and health comes from studies in wealthy, urbanized nations. Can we really assume these findings apply to everyone, everywhere? The researchers behind this study are calling for more inclusive research that reflects the full diversity of human experience, not just the privileged corners of the world. At the end of the day, this study delivers a powerful message. What we once believed to be a universal truth about aging may actually be a story shaped by our environment, our habits, and the way we live. So, what do you think? Is inflammaging a product of modern life, or is there a deeper, hidden process at work that we're not yet able to detect? Do you agree with the idea that our understanding of aging needs to be more global and inclusive? Share your thoughts. Do you see this as a challenge to the status quo, or do you think the traditional view still holds up? Let's get the conversation started.